In this video, we're going to be talking about some basics of program development. Now that we're introducing functions, we need to make sure that we're designing our code to make use of that and making our programs modular enough to make use of functions and to be easy for somebody else to follow. The first thing that you want to do when you're designing a new program is to actually sit down and design. So these are some guidelines for before you begin coding. Try to answer all of these questions before you go to code blocks. What data are you going to need for the program? How should that data be stored? What are you going to need to do with the data? Once you know what you need to do, what functions can you build to do those actions? What kind of information are those functions going to need? What parameters should they have? What kind of values are they going to return? How is main going to call them? What's the overall flow of control going to look like? And this is a common process called design, and anybody who builds a large-scale project is going to go through several iterations of this process before they start their implementation phase, which is coding. So it's not important that you do them in order 1 through 7. You may do them in any order, and you may have to go back to an earlier question and adjust your answer before you have a complete design. So you might do this in any order, any number of times before you settle on what your final design is going to be. So do all of this before implementation, before code. Once you have a plan, once you have your design for the solution, write a small section of code. Then test it. And if it doesn't work the way that you expect, debug as necessary. Debugging is just the process of finding and removing errors from code. So remember, logical errors are going to be the hardest to find. That's why it's very important to write test cases that are designed to find those logical errors. Write your code incrementally and then test. If you don't get the answer you expect, debug the code and test again until you do get the answer you expect. You don't want to write the whole program before you try to compile and test it, because if there's a problem, it'll be much harder to find. A basic method for debugging is to simply insert print format functions at different points in the code to check the values of variables. You can, for example, calculate an average and then print that value to the screen and double check with a calculator to make sure it's correct. If you're not sure about the value of a variable, you can always print it out to see what it is. This is particularly true in if statements if you need to monitor your counters or other variables as the loop iterates. There are two primary methods of testing called black box testing and white box testing. In black box testing, we create functions and then treat them as black boxes. If a box is black, you can't see into it. So our test cases are going to be based solely on the inputs and outputs of that function. If we provided this set of inputs, what outputs do we expect? If we run the function, do we get those outputs? In white box testing, we can see inside the box, which is the function, and we should create test cases that are specifically designed to run each line of code in that program or function. That's what we were doing when we created if statements, and we specifically created test cases to check for both the if it's true and when it's not true. In general, we want to aim for 10 or more test cases that do a combination of black box and white box techniques. So for an example, we're going to develop this fruit stand program. Users using the program are allowed to buy fruit from a fruit stand. They'll begin with a certain amount of money. Each time they visit the fruit stand, they're asked whether or not they want to buy fruit. And if the answer is yes, we'll ask how many they would like to buy. We'll then ask them for the money to carry out the transaction. We'll calculate how much change they should get and print out their change that they're receiving. What we're going to print is a string with one character for each coin they'll be getting. So as an example, if we were to give them 3 dimes, we would see D, 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 D for dime. If they're going to get a quarter and a dime, they would see Q and then D for quarter and then dime. At the end of the program, we'll print out a report of how many fruits were purchased and how much money the user has left. So of course, there's a couple of different things going on in here, and we want to design our program to have functions to complete the tasks for our fruit stand. We're always going to have a main function. Main is going to need to ask the user how much money that they're starting with. So every user has an initial amount of money. That's from right here. Then we'll loop for each visit to the fruit stand. Whenever they leave, we should print that final status report. That status report comes from here. At the end of the program, print out how much they spent, how much money they have left, and how many fruits they purchased. And so that's all main is in control of. We'll then build some other functions to control the rest of the program. We'll have a menu. This will ask if they'd like to buy fruit or if they're ready to leave. We have that status report for the end. We'll have a buy function. For how many fruits they're buying. We'll have a change function to determine how much change the user is getting. And we're going to have a print function which prints the change that the user is going to be getting. So these are all of our basic tasks that we need to create. We need to make a menu. We need to make a status function. We'll need a buy function, a change function, and a print function. And of course, every program in C is going to have a main function. So we'll pick one of these to start with. And let's start with print change, because that should be fairly simple. We have a basic outline already started. This is the fruit stand program. We're including, of course, the standard input-output library. I've also created a constant for the cost of fruit. All of our fruits cost the same amount, and they all cost 99 cents. Now we can have our function prototypes. We're going to start with print change. Most print functions, if all they do is print, they don't return any values. So most print functions are void functions. So we'll call it print change, and it should take in the change that the user's getting. So we're going to give them the amount of cents that the user's getting as change, and we'll print out what that looks like using a string. We will assume that cents is non-negative. We can't give a negative amount of change to somebody. And since it's a void function, we're not returning anything, but we are going to print each coin of change that the user is going to be getting, where Q is for quarter, D is for dime, N is for nickel, and P is for penny. We can figure out how many of each type of coin we need just by doing some simple division. So we'll figure out how many quarters we need by seeing how many times 25 divides into cents. Similarly, the number of dimes that we need by figuring out how many times 10 goes into dimes. So we're doing integer division here. Each of these are integers. Cents is an integer. These are integer literals. And then we'll get our leftover pennies by using the mod operator. Whatever we can't fill with nickels will be left over to do with pennies. Now we can print out the correct number of characters for each of these values. So a Q for each quarter, a D for each dime, etc. And then at the end of the function, we'll return. So this should be a function that will print our change, but to make sure that it's working correctly, we should stop here and do a couple test cases. We can test a function just by calling it from main with some specific test cases. We can control what the value of cents is and double check that we get the correct answer. So for example, if we say we want to print 0 cents, we should not see any print statements. So if we build and run it, we don't see any print statements. There are no coins to return because there's no change. Let's try a couple more. If our change is 5, we should return 1 nickel. So things are looking good at the moment. Let's try 47 cents. Now we should be seeing our first logical error. This is quite a few more coins than 47 cents. It's the correct number of quarters, there should be 1 quarter. It's the correct number of pennies, there should be 2 pennies, but we've got the wrong number of dimes and nickels. We've got 40 cents in dimes right here. So there's a problem with our function. Specifically, we're not updating the value of cents after we figure out how many quarters we need. So for example, if we're giving 47 cents of change, after we give them a quarter, we should have 22 cents left. So we should then give them 2 dimes and then 2 pennies. So after we figure out the number of quarters that we're going to give them, we should deduct that amount from our cents. And it's the same story after each of our other values. After we figure out how many dimes we're going to give them, we should deduct that from our remaining cents. So now, after we divide by each of our coin values, we're going to then deduct that amount from our total number of cents. So now, if we try our test case again, we see the correct output, which is 1 quarter, 2 dimes, and 2 pennies. If we'd gone on to write our other functions, if we had 5 other functions to look through, it might be much more complicated to figure out where the incorrect input's coming from. So it's important to stop and test our code after we write it. Let's build another function. Menu is another fairly easy one. So we'll create a menu function that returns the user's choice. Now menu has an empty parameter list, so we can say there are no preconditions. But the purpose of the menu function is to prompt the user with a menu and return their response. So we've already said that every time they visit the fruit stand, we're going to ask if they would like to purchase something. So we'll ask them if they would like to buy some fruit and say that 1 is for yes, and that 2 is for leaving. We'll read in their response into this integer answer and return that value to main. So we'll continue to use main to test our code. We've tested print change, so we're going to get rid of that. We'll call menu and make sure that the value that it returns is the same as the value that the user enters. So we're using our print format function for debugging purposes. We want to know what choice is, so we're just going to print out the value of choice. So that if the user says yes, we get 1. If the user says they'd rather leave, then they get to leave. So menu is working correctly. And we have a few more functions to write. Let's do the buy function next. One of the things that we have to keep track of in main is the number of fruits that the user is purchasing. So when they buy something, we need to return the number of things that they bought. So in this function, we're going to ask the user how many fruits they want to buy and return that value to main. So we'll just ask the user, how many fruits would you like to buy? And read in their response into num, and then return this number to the main function. And so we'll test this the same as we did for menu. Now I'll just call our buy function instead, and this is just to make sure that we're returning the correct value to main. If we enter 5, we get 5. If we enter 3, we get 3. So we're getting the correct values back. And so far, all of our functions are working. So now we need to figure out how to calculate their change. So we'll need to base that on the number of fruits that are being purchased and how much they're going to pay for them. So to calculate their change, we'll have to tell them how much they owe and ask how much they're going to give us, and also update their total amount of money. So we're going to return a float value that we can use to update in main their total amount of cash. We're also going to pass to them the number of fruits that they decided to purchase. So we should assume that if they're going to buy fruits, that they're buying a non-negative number of fruits. They're not giving us fruits, they're buying fruits. And as a post condition, we will tell the user the total for this singular transaction. ask the user how much they will pay. Calculate and print their change, and return the amount that the user spent. So this one's one of our more complicated programs so far. So first, we'll figure out the cost. That's num fruits times our constant cost. Now, constants are global to the program. Once we've declared a constant, we can use that anywhere. So it doesn't matter which function we're in, we can access the cost of fruits, which is 99 cents. So we'll tell them how much their current price is and ask them how much they're going to pay for this transaction. We'll scan that value in. So now that we have the user's amount of cash, we can figure out what their change is going to be. So we can print the number of fruits that they're buying, their total price, ask them how much they're going to pay, read that into cash, and figure out what their change should be. We're multiplying by 100 to take care of the cents that are inherent in money. So if they're paying us $5.50 and their total is $5.25, we're actually going to calculate their change as 550 minus 525 so that they'll get 25 cents back. Then we can print out their change using the function that we've already built. Print change with the number of cents that they're getting for change. To finish off our function, we'll return the amount that the user spent on their purchase so that we can deduct that from their total amount of cash that we have in main. So now that we've built this function, we need to test it. We'll have to test for the return value given a certain parameter. So in main, we'll have a float for the user's cash, and we'll start that at 10, which means if we print out their cash before purchase, they should have $10. Then they're going to make a purchase of, say, 2 fruits. And we'll print their cash again after purchase to make sure it's been updated correctly. So let's try it with basic input of 2 fruits that we're purchasing. We got $10 of initial cash. Cost of 2 fruits is $1.98. So let's say we're going to pay $2. Our change is going to be 2 pennies, and our cash after purchase will be $8.02. So our change function is also working the way that we expect it to. That only leaves us with one remaining function, which is the status, who at the end of the program prints out the total number of fruit purchased and the amount of cash that the user has left. So we'll build this status report. So we get the total number of fruit purchased has to at least be 0. And we'll also get the remaining cash that the user has. Must also be non-negative. They can't have spent more money than they actually started with. And for our post condition, we will print the final status report. So we'll give them the final number of fruits that they've purchased. And how much cash they have remaining. And since it's our final status report, we'll also thank them for shopping at our fruit stand before we return. Okay. So now all we have left to do is to create a main function that will utilize these functions that we've created, paying attention to their preconditions to make sure that we don't introduce any new logical errors. So we'll remove our test code from main and try to populate it with our actual values that we need to have available for us. We're going to need their cash on hand. We're also going to track the number of fruit that they've purchased, which will start at 0. We'll also need their choice for whether or not they would like to purchase any fruits. And so choice will be updated by menu. Menu has an empty parameter list, so there are no preconditions. We're going to get back from them their choice. And as long as choice is not equal to 2, then they would like to buy some fruit. So before we allow that to happen, we're going to double check that they have enough cash to do so. So first we're going to need their starting amount of cash. So we'll start with their initial amount, and if they would like to buy some fruit, before we call the buy function, if they don't have enough money to buy anything, so if they have less than the amount of one piece of fruit, then we don't want to allow them to purchase anything. But if they do have enough money, then we're going to prompt them with how many fruits they would like to purchase. Fruit's going to be for the total number, so we're also going to add in how much fruit they're currently buying. And that value is returned from the buy function. Well, that one also has an empty parameter list, so it shouldn't have any preconditions for us to consider. But before we call the change function, we have to make sure that this value is non-negative. So if they pick a value that is less than 0, then that is not a valid amount of fruit, and we will prompt them again. And we'll continue to do that until they give us something that is 0 or higher. After that, we can then call our change function, which will update the user's total amount of cash. And we'll also print the amount of change that they're going to get from an individual transaction. So they're buying a current number of fruit. We'll update their cash. We'll also update their total number of fruits that they've purchased by adding in the current amount of fruit. Before we leave the while loop, we'll give them a chance to update choice by presenting the menu again and giving them the option to quit. When they do choose to quit, we'll then call the final status function with the total number of fruits that they purchased and their remaining cash. That will be the end of the program. So we tested each individual function. Now we've built a main that uses those functions, and now we're ready to check to make sure everything works cohesively. So we'll run the program and see how it goes. We're going to start with $10 of initial cash. We would like to buy some fruits. We'll go ahead and buy 2 of them and pay $2 for that. So we're going to get 2 pennies of change. It's condensed here with would you like to buy some fruit. So what that tells us is that we need to go to our print change function and add a new line before the return statement. But for right now, we'll buy some more fruit, and we'll get 5 of them this time. And we'll get a nickel of change. So we'll say, no, we're now done buying fruit. So we've purchased 7 total fruits, 2 in our first transaction, 5 in our second one, and we have $3.07 remaining. So we can go ahead and make that change to our print change function just by coming down to the bottom of print change, putting a nice new line in there. That'll help clean it up. So now if we tell it we would like to buy some fruits, it'll give us our change and then put a little space between the next time. Alright, that's our fruit stand example. In our next video, we'll do some tracing problems so that we can practice reading code and figuring out how the flow of control works now that we've introduced functions to our programs. I'll see you then.